just want it.
Can you see myself? Can you see myself? Can you see myself?
Nosferatu, Revenant, Aswang, Strigoi, Ubur, Rakshasa, Vampire. Myths and legends from cultures the world over echo the name of creatures risen from the dead to prey on the living. But rarely have they been more real or frightening than in Eastern Europe 300 years ago. In Europe of the 17th century, the secrets of nature were only first being uncovered by science. Superstition was still a way of life. It was in this period, while smoke from the Inquisition and its witch hunts still hung heavily in the air, that the vampire we recognize was first encountered.
Hungary, Moravia, Silesia, and Poland are the principal theater of these happenings. For here we are told that dead men who have been dead for several months, I say, return from the tomb, are heard to speak, walk about, infest hamlets and villages, injure both men and animals whose blood they drain, thereby making them sick and ill and at length actually causing death. The name given to these ghosts is upirs, or vampires, which in the Slavic tongues means a bloodsucker. Dom Augustin Calmet, 1746.
Accounts like this exist throughout Europe, written not by authors of fiction, but by priests, doctors, and government officials. They investigated and scrupulously recorded accounts of what were believed to be real vampires. One startling report came from Medvegia, Serbia, in 1732. Over a period of 3 months, 17 villages reportedly died of vampire attacks. This train of vampires was traced to the late Arnaud Payol, who, rumor held, had been attacked by a vampire years before in Turkey.
In order to end this evil, they dug up this Arnaud Payol 40 days after his death, and they found that he was quite complete and undecayed. Fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, and the shirt, the covering, and the coffin were completely bloody. The old nails on his hands and feet, along with the skin, had fallen off, and new ones had grown. And since they saw from this that he was a true vampire, they drove a stake through his heart, according to their custom, whereby he gave an audible groan and bled copiously. Johannes Fulkinger, Regiment Medical Officer, Serbia, 1732.
Due to the infectious nature of vampirism, all of the victims were also destroyed. The threat of the vampire was temporarily ended. Yet this pattern of sickness and death would repeat itself for generations. It was a time of religious fervor and superstition. The unexplainable was seen as the work of evil. When a village was visited by bizarre sickness or death, it was often judged to be the work of a vampire. Feeling their mortal souls threatened, the living prepared a battle with the dead. A battle that the living did not always win. Death, the imminent confrontation of mortality, has through the ages been the source of our deepest fears and superstitions. The vampire we know today is an elegant creation of fiction that bears little resemblance to the truly frightening vampire found in history and folklore. The vampire of folklore was not an aristocratic stranger. It was a husband, a daughter, a neighbor, someone who had died and been buried, and then returned from the grave to bring death to those it had known in life. In fiction, the bite of the vampire causes the victim to transform after death. Folklore, too, held that the bite was enough to infect the victim. But the chest area over the heart was almost always the vampire's target. And in folklore, there are many other ways. Murderers, alcoholics, criminals, bodies buried improperly or not buried at all. Those who died unnaturally by violence, suicide, drowning, stroke, or disease were all at particular risk. There were thousands of vampires encountered in Europe. They were judged by the peculiar circumstances of their births, their lives, or their deaths. But the single factor that bound all vampires was the ability to kill by draining the lifeblood or the life essence of their victims. The vampire has been a topic of special interest to author and historian Raymond McNally.
The blood connection is extremely important in any understanding of vampires. The Bible says the blood is the life. The blood is the life. When the blood went out of somebody, the life ebbed out as the blood went out of you. So primitive humans made a simple association. If life goes out when blood goes out, therefore blood must be the source of life itself. So what if you could make the blood flow back in?
By drinking the blood of his victims, the vampire was able to obtain a kind of cursed immortality.
They appear from midday to midnight and come to drink the blood of living people and animals in such great abundance that sometimes it comes out of their mouths, their noses, and especially their ears. Sometimes the body swims in the blood, which is spilled out into its coffin. This revenant, or vampire, comes out of the tomb and goes about at night violently attacking and seizing its friends and relatives and sucking their blood until they are weakened and exhausted, and finally causes their death. Mercure Galland, 1693.
Such was the menace of the vampire that whenever possible, precautions were taken to prevent the dead from rising. Burial methods include the use of pins, needles, and nails to hold bodies still. Sometimes, bodies were buried with their heads cut off and placed behind them, so they couldn't see where they were going if they came back to life. Sometimes, limbs were bound together or even severed completely. One modern burial practice may be a remnant of the age of vampires, according to historian Michael Bell.
There is a folk belief that one of the functions of headstones is to keep whatever is in the grave there, pinned down, so to speak. There's also a folk belief that gravestones that are tilted like this one are an indication that whatever is in there, whether it's a vampire or a revenant, has access outside the grave. In folk tradition, it's not necessary to say the vampire physically, in the corporeal body, comes out and sucks your blood by biting your neck with fangs. But the belief was that there was someone in the grave who was not dead yet.
The only hope for people whose loved ones were sick and dying was to find the vampire and destroy it. Gripped in a mood of superstition and fear, terrified villagers would search the cemeteries for vampires. The practice of stalking the vampire became so common that a crude profession developed for a few brave and curious men, the vampire hunters. Matthew Bunsen, the author of the Vampire Encyclopedia, explains.
The vampire hunter of the European tradition was, by definition, a very well-educated individual. These were men who held distinguished positions in very much esteemed universities. These were doctors of philosophy, of theology, of history. They taught, they wrote, but at the same time, they had a fundamental belief that vampires existed. As a result, these, as I said, very distinguished gentlemen resigned their positions or took sabbaticals, and they literally traveled around Europe, visiting villages, visiting cities, visiting archives, anywhere that they believed that real cases of vampirism or vampire attacks had occurred.
Dr. Johannes von Lobel in the late 1700s hunted the fertile grounds of Serbia for vampires, maintaining that he could feel a slight pulse in some vampiric corpses. Dom Calmet, a French cleric and theologian, was perhaps the best known and most faithful documentarian of the vampire hunters. He left no doubt about the frightening menace of the vampire.
The particulars which are related of them are so singular, so detailed, accompanied with circumstances so probable and so likely, as well as with the most weighty and well-attested legal deposition, that it seems impossible not to subscribe to the belief which prevails in these countries that these apparitions do actually come forth from their graves, and that they are able to produce the terrible effects which are so widely and so positively attributed to them. Dom Augustin Calmet, 1746.
This vampire hunter's kit from 1879, although never used, contains the tools most commonly employed to bring the souls of the undead their final peace.
There evolved over time the idea of the so-called vampire hunter's kit. This would include such useful items as the mallet, the stake. It might include as well the crucifix. If this is a person specifically appointed by the church or who knew someone in the church and who had permission, it would also include holy water, it could include holy oil, and most important of all, it could include the Holy Eucharist. The vampire hunter's kit might also include certain utilitarian items, such as rope, because you never know where you might have to climb. It might have certain types of crowbars in order to work open locks or safes. In later times, it might even include a pistol, because you never knew who you might have to shoot. Some species of vampire, such as the Noxer or the Nosferat, were particularly susceptible to bullet wounds.
Garlic was also commonly used. Its odor was believed to overpower the stench of a corpse and frighten it away.
All the elements of the vampire hunter's kit, particularly those that were intended to destroy or inhibit a vampire, had not only a religious but also a very important symbolic connotation. The stake, for example, represented two different ideas. On the one hand, there was the necessity to impale the vampire, that is, to pin it symbolically to the ground. By doing this, you ended its spiritual life, but you also brought it once again into contact with the earth, where hopefully decomposition would begin and the process of death would take its course.
With friends or relatives often hanging to life by a thread, determined villagers, sometimes in the company of expert vampire hunters, ventured into graveyards, armed for confrontations with the unknown. What they found would inspire centuries of mortal terror. Graveyards have always been places of mystery. Invested with the terrifying prospect of death, they inspire a kind of gut reaction, a fear of the unknown. For centuries, they've been the haunting grounds of the supernatural. In the town of Breslau, in what is today Germany, the graveyard was the scene of an encounter with a vampire, once a local shoemaker, who had committed suicide. For 8 months, townspeople told stories of visitations in the night. The shoemaker's ghost, they said, would come to them in bed and smother them with a grip so hard that it left marks.
In the opened grave, they found the body complete and undamaged by decay. but blown up like a drum. The limbs all still hung together. Not stiffened like those of other dead people, but one could move them easily. On his feet, the skin had peeled away and another had grown, much purer and stronger than the first. Its head was cut off, its hands and feet dismembered, after which the back was cut open and the heart taken out, which looked as good as that of a freshly slaughtered calf. Everything together was burned on a pyre. Early in the morning, when the stack of wood had burned up, the ashes, in a sack, were thrown into the flowing water. Prussia, 1591.
In the early 1700s, vampire killings were commonplace throughout Europe. They were founded in cultural beliefs with ancient roots. Virtually all societies of the world have legends of the restless undead that haunt the living and draw their blood. The vampire of Europe was most likely brought from somewhere in India by nomadic gypsies.
The most likely candidate for the birthplace of the vampire is in the Indus Valley, in that a very early civilization dated to the 3rd millennium BC. It was there that we have evidence of some of the earliest of the vampire cults, the worship or the veneration of so-called vampire gods, or supreme, if not highly powerful beings of nature who were placated and satisfied with sacrifices and offerings of blood.
Along trade routes from the Far East had come legends of demons that drank the blood of the living. From the West came a powerful religion that held the blood of a savior as sacred. Nearly 300 years ago, they clashed in Eastern Europe. Armed with Christian conviction, people were able to reconcile their superstition with their faith. The cross would become the universal weapon against the vampire. Western soldiers occupying Eastern Europe began to file grisly reports on the practice of exhuming bodies and killing them. By 1732, at least 14 books about vampirism had been published in Germany alone. In 1734, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the word vampire officially entered the English language. It would have an impact on the culture for centuries to follow. In New England, the center of American Puritanism and witch hunts, accounts almost a century later bore a striking resemblance to the vampire killings of Eastern Europe. On May 20th, 1854, Horace Ray of Griswold, Connecticut, as reported in the Norwich Courier, was exhumed and his heart destroyed to stop the continued deaths of his relatives. Although the term vampire was never used, it is evident that vampire superstitions had crossed to America. This cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island, is the site of one of America's most noted vampire cases.
Well, the most well-known vampire incident in Rhode Island, probably in New England, happened in 1892. And it's most well-known because it's reported in the Providence Journal and the Journal Bulletin, the local newspaper for that time. And this happened in Exeter, Rhode Island, in March of 1892. What happened at that time was Mercy Brown's body was exhumed and her heart was cut out and burned on a rock, and the ashes were fed to someone in the family who was dying of tuberculosis.
There's also the story of Nellie L. Vaughn, who died in 1889. Rumors began spreading almost a century after her death that she was a vampire. Her headstone read, "I am waiting and watching for you." Legend says no vegetation will grow on Nellie's grave. The headstone was recently removed to stop repeated vandalism. Yet hardly a day goes by when people don't show up to have a look. There have been enough incidents of vampirism in the 2 centuries since Dom Calmet and the early vampire hunters to keep interest in vampires alive. Though few would admit it, belief in actual vampires remains a silent and chilling conviction. Even into the first half of this century, British Reverend R. Montague Summers continued the search for vampires. Summers investigated widespread occurrences of vampirism and the vampiric appearance of corpses. His conclusion, after authoring 2 of the most famous books on vampires, was that vampires were indeed real. Is it possible that real vampires have existed all this time? The rational mind knows better. Yet an experience of Raymond McNally's at a funeral in Transylvania only a few years ago reveals that the idea is not dead at all.
And I saw that at the town of Rodna in Transylvania when I was there. I was visiting and along came a funeral procession. I asked what had happened and they told me, the villagers, that it was a girl who had committed suicide. Now, one of the candidates to become a vampire is someone who's committed suicide, led a violent death. There are other categories. I knew that there was potential trouble there. So I stayed around for the ceremony, and I noticed they buried her only 1 foot under the ground. Couldn't figure that out, very shallow grave. Well, I found out why, because after the official religious ceremony, the villagers came out to the graveyard, they dug up the coffin, and they did what you see in the movies, only they did it effectively. They drove the wooden stake through the body, into, through the wooden coffin bottom, and then into the ground.
Is there a basis in reality for a belief in vampires? What basis is there in reality for a belief in vampires? The cursed immortality of the vampire is an idea that entices us. We are lured by the prospect of answering our deepest curiosities about life and death. Vampires both threaten our mortality and defy our understanding of it. The most detailed evidence of vampires comes from the eyewitnesses and vampire hunters of the 1700s. Their accounts have been studied extensively by anthropologist Paul Barber.
It seems pretty clear that people generally come up with comprehensive theories to account for the things that they don't understand. And the theory of the vampires is actually a very far-reaching theory of this kind that tries to explain a whole lot of events associated with death and decomposition. When people died, the people around them were aware that one of the possibilities was that they would die too. These are people who didn't know about disease vectors, and so they accounted for them in very different ways. And because of the common belief, which historically is attested all over the world, that death is brought by the dead, what they tended to do was to dig up the dead and try to determine if they were in fact causing these deaths.
But the people of the 17th century had little idea of what to expect when they uncovered a body. They were experienced with decomposition primarily above ground. In a grave, decomposition occurs much more slowly. The unexpected appearance of bodies convinced them that they had found vampires.
The body, except for the nose, which was somewhat fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and beard, even the nails, of which the old ones had fallen away, had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new one had emerged from it. The face, hands, and feet, and the whole body were so constituted that they could not have been more complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which, according to the common observation, he had sucked from the people killed by him. Imperial Provisor, Radisk District, Hungary, 1725.
In the attempt to kill it, in what they viewed as killing it, they would discover that there were other events taking place that caused them to believe that the corpse was in fact alive in some sense. One of these was the fact that the corpse wasn't in rigor mortis, but we wouldn't expect the corpse to be in rigor mortis because that's a temporary condition. Another is that they discovered that if they cut off its head or drove a stake into it or cut it into pieces, that the corpse would bleed. Again, this is not an unusual event. It's true that blood coagulates at death, but it's also true that it very often becomes liquid again. And the most striking event that they describe is if they killed it in such a way as to put pressure on the corpse, for example, by driving a stake into the chest, the corpse would let out a groan. Well, it's pretty clear that this is, again, not an unusual situation because the corpse is still intact, and if you push down on the chest, what you're doing is forcing air past the glottis and causing a very lifelike groan. But this is something that was extremely frightening to people.
Yet the fear caused by these incidents is not enough to explain the continued belief in vampires. How could killing a vampiric corpse actually end episodes of supposed vampirism? The answer may lie in a unique coincidence.
At first it may seem strange that the disease of tuberculosis is associated with vampires or vampirism, but when you look at the symptoms attributed to both, then you can see there's some reasonable connections. First of all, tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it 100 years ago, usually it settled in the lungs. That's what consumption was, tuberculosis of the lungs. And it rotted away the lungs, to put it bluntly, so that a person who was suffering from tuberculosis would get weaker and weaker, and it was worse at night. Someone lying flat on the back, for example, the lungs might fill with fluid, they would cough up blood, there might be blood on the corner of the mouth. When they woke up, they might complain that the chest felt like a weight was on the chest, and then day by day they would seem to lose vitality and strength and get paler and weaker. And those are basically the same symptoms attributed to vampires.
People of the 1700s may not have had the scientific information they needed, but the empirical evidence they gathered over time served them well. Bodies buried in shallow graves during times of epidemic disease were likely to remain contagious. Disposing of these bodies using the same methods used for killing vampires, burning in particular, did indeed reduce the spread of disease. Plagues like tuberculosis devastated Europe. They may well have played a key part in creation of the vampire. But an even more frightening explanation was uncovered by Dr. Franz Hartmann, an Austrian physician who preserved some of the most interesting vampire tales of the 19th century. Dr. Hartmann documented hundreds of cases of premature burial, once a horribly common occurrence. In Cripplegate, England, there is still a monument to Constance Whitney, who was unfortunately buried while in a coma. Later, the caretaker opened the coffin to remove a valuable ring which had been left on her finger. When the lid opened, she awakened. So frequent and well documented were these cases that an international panic occurred in the 19th century over the fear of being buried alive. People began installing devices in their coffins to sound a warning, and notify those above ground that immediate rescue was needed. Hartman's findings indicated that many of the vampires of the 1700s were people dying of disease who were pronounced dead, only to rise again and frighten all who saw. When cases of premature burial were combined with observations of corpses by people without advanced medical knowledge, they thought they'd found solid evidence for vampirism. The vampire hunters had no way of knowing that their observations would one day be explained by the science of the future. Instead, their reports became the foundation for public acceptance of the reality of vampires, and vampire hysteria spread across Europe.
There was inevitably, however, a certain cultural or intellectual backlash against this kind of thought. This occurred in the 18th century as a result of rationalism, of skepticism, and you had authors and philosophers such as Rousseau and Voltaire speaking out against this idea of vampires living in Europe or preying upon the living throughout Europe. So the rationalism, the idea of the skeptics throughout the 18th century helped lay the groundwork of discrediting the idea of the vampire in terms of the public imagination.
But the vampire has never been a creature to die easily.
The irony was that by debunking the vampire, by reducing him as a figure of popular belief, they made them all the more appealing to the imagination. And once they did that, it was inevitable that the Gothic writers, those writers who accepted and perfected the ideas of terror, of the night, of the primordial aspects of fear of death, should inevitably pick up on this idea. So, the vampire itself then became one of the important embodiments of Gothic literature. And we enter into an entirely new era of writing, an entirely new era for the vampire. For contrary to what Voltaire thought, vampires would indeed begin appearing in Paris, and they would appear in London as well.
It was in the imagination of European writers that the true horror really began. Over time, vampires have evolved into one of our most popular romantic fictions. They're compelling for their horror and their insight into the depths of the human soul. Today, vampire fiction is more popular than ever, due to the work of authors like Anne Rice.
There's something emotional and mystical about that figure. And even if you were to go to an audience for a movie, and a vampire movie, and you would ask every person in line, what's it really about? I don't think they could really tell you. You either get it or you don't get it. But some of us, when we look at that figure on the screen or when we read about him in literature, we feel a kind of heightened awareness, a kind of dark emotional thrill. It strikes a chord very deep in us. Maybe we'll never fully understand, and maybe we shouldn't. Art is the place where we express those things that we don't fully understand.
The consummate vampire story was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Stoker based his story on Vlad Tepes IV, a Transylvanian ruler who lived from 1431 to 1462. Vlad Tepes was a sworn knight of the Dracul. He was known for being exceptionally cruel in meting out justice. His preferred punishment was impalement. Vlad's name was Dracula, meaning dragon or devil.
The irony of Bram Stoker's career, as far as the Dracula novel is, most people think It's made up. The story say, oh, it's a vampire story. Some guy with a wild imagination sat down and dreamed up this thing. No, he didn't dream up anything but the connection. Yes, the connection. And he wrote it up well. I mean, he had a talent for writing. But everything in there is authentic Transylvanian folklore.
Stoker's Dracula is a figure of ultimate evil, but to the local people he was a hero. Badescu Cesar is a community leader and history teacher in Arefu, a village in the shadow of Vlad's castle.
Domnia lui Vlad Țepeș aparține secolului al XV.
Vlad Tepes reigned in the 15th century, and the myths about werewolves and vampires only appeared later. Myths that have nothing to do with reality. The real Vlad Tepes had no desire to see bloodshed. He was rather a symbol of justice. He used impalement as punishment, not because he liked it. He had to do it in order to try to uproot the evil happening in Taura Romanesca at that time. For the people of Arefu, Vlad Tepes was the king and master of the country, a man who knew how to be just and would always generously reward those who deserved it. He remains one of the great rulers of ancient Romania.
The misty mountains and dark, ruined castles of Transylvania were an ideal location to set tales of Gothic horror. The rich cultural mix of East and West that helped create the vampire in the 17th century had become an exotic and mysterious backdrop. The model of modern fiction for the female vampire is based on another real character from history, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, also known as the Blood Countess. Countess Bathory was born in 1560 in a part of Hungary that edged the Carpathian Mountains.
Elizabeth Bathory also spawned a legend, famous legend, that she used blood for cosmetic purposes. And supposedly, according to this legend, she thought that the blood made her skin acquire the characteristics of the young girls who served her. But actually what she did was something even more horrible. She believed in an old adage that you are what you eat. So she recorded in her diary some 650 girls. She butchered and then devoured parts of their bodies because she thought that way she could acquire their characteristics.
For her crimes, she was imprisoned for life behind a brick wall in a room with no windows. Finally, in the year 1614, one of her jailers wanted to get a look at the Countess, reputedly one of the most beautiful women in Europe. There was an opening in the door through which food was passed. When the jailer looked in, he saw the Countess lying still on the floor. The woman who had lived for admiration had died unseen. These factual stories have added a dimension of realism to the fictional vampire. They have helped build it from its folkloric roots into one of our hottest cultural icons. The fictional vampire has achieved real immortality in the imagination.
The vampire haunts our imagination, and each person who comes up with a vampire character and writes about that character is responding to a whole lot of inheritance and a whole lot of subconscious thoughts. The figure himself is wonderful. He's magnetic. He's a metaphor for the predator in all of us, the outsider in all of us. I mean, I think there's no end to what you could write using the vampire as a metaphor for everyone. I think the vampire will always be with us in one form or another. I think he sank a bit in this century when for a while he was the subject of pulp literature, but now once again you have all kinds of people writing the very best books they can write, and there are vampires in them.
When vampires got into film, they took on yet another life.
It's in the theater and eventually in the movies that the vampire has achieved immortality. It's a theme that just keeps coming back again and again. In the 1820s, it was the craze in France to have vampire plays. There was even a vampire opera. And of course, here the element is to connect it up with the romantic hero, which is completely at odds with the folklore. In the folklore, the vampire is disgusting. It's a walking corpse. It's got a fetid breath. It's horrible in the original sense of that word, horrible. But the Romantics made this addition of the vampire as an attractive, suave, continental type who would kiss your hand, you know, and that sort of thing. So they added that element, and that element continued.
I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible that I mistrust my own judgment.
The German Nosferatu came closest to portraying the vampire of antiquity. But with Hollywood's romantic imagery, the vampire was changed forever. The Prince of Darkness has been personified by, among others, Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Frank Langella, and Gary Oldman. The story of the vampire continues to unfold. Skeptics may laugh at notions of real vampires, yet history has given us a rich legacy of Gothic horror, which continues to pique our interest. There are those who believe that vampires still walk among us, and there are a few of us who would spend the night in a dark cemetery. Vampires remain more than mere fiction. They are the reality of the unknown, and one of our favorite fears.
Hamlets and villages, injure both men and animals whose blood they drain, thereby making them sick and ill and at length actually causing death. The name given to these ghosts is upirs, or vampires, which in the Slavic tongues means a bloodsucker. Dom Augustin Calmet, 1746.
Accounts like this exist throughout Europe. written not by authors of fiction, but by priests, doctors, and government officials. They investigated and scrupulously recorded accounts of what were believed to be real vampires. One startling report came from Medvegia, Serbia, in 1732. Over a period of 3 months, 17 villages reportedly died of vampire attacks. This train of vampires was traced to the late Arnold Payol, who, rumor held, had been attacked by a vampire years before in Turkey.
In order to end this evil, they dug up this Arnold Payol 40 days after his death, and they found that he was quite complete and undecayed. Fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, and the shirt, the covering, and the coffin were completely bloody. The old nails on his hands and feet, along with the skin, had fallen off, and new ones had grown. And since this...
Historian Raymond McNally.
The blood connection is extremely important in any understanding of vampires. The Bible says the blood is the life. The blood is the life. When the blood went out of somebody, the life ebbed out as the blood went out of you. So primitive humans made a simple association. If life goes out when blood goes out, therefore blood must be the source of life itself. So what if you could make the blood flow back in?
By drinking the blood of his victims, the vampire was able to obtain a kind of cursed immortality.
They appear from midday to midnight and come to drink the blood of living people and animals in such great abundance that sometimes it comes out of their mouths, their noses, and especially their ears. Sometimes the body swims in the blood, which is spilled out into its coffin. This revenant, or vampire, comes out of the tomb and goes about at night violently attacking and seizing its friends and relatives and sucking their blood until they are weakened and exhausted, and finally causes their death. Mercure Galland, 1693.
Such was the menace of the vampire that whenever possible, precautions were taken to prevent the dead from rising. Burial methods include the use of pins, little resemblance to the truly frightening vampire found in history and folklore. The vampire of folklore was not an aristocratic stranger. It was a husband, a daughter, a neighbor, someone who had died and been buried, and then returned from the grave to bring death to those it had known in life. In fiction, the bite of the vampire causes the victim to transform after death. Folklore, too, held that the bite was enough to infect the victim. But the chest area over the heart was almost always the vampire's target. And in folklore, there are many other ways. Murderers, alcoholics, criminals, bodies buried improperly or not buried at all. Those who died unnaturally by violence, suicide, drowning, stroke, or disease were all at particular risk. There were thousands of vampires encountered in Europe. They were judged by the peculiar circumstances of their births, their lives, or their deaths. But the single factor that bound all vampires was the ability to kill by draining the lifeblood or the life essence of their victims. The vampire has been a topic of special interest to author and historian.
Saw from this that he was a true vampire. They drove a stake through his heart, according to their custom, whereby he gave an audible groan and bled copiously. Johannes Fulkinger, Regiment Medical Officer, Serbia, 1732.
Due to the infectious nature of vampirism, all of the victims were also destroyed. The threat of the vampire was temporarily ended. Yet this pattern of sickness and death would repeat itself for generations. It was a time of religious fervor and superstition. The unexplainable was seen as the work of evil. When a village was visited by bizarre sickness or death, it was often judged to be the work of a vampire. Feeling their mortal souls threatened, the living prepared a battle with the dead. A battle that the living did not always win. Death, the imminent confrontation of mortality, has through the ages been the source of our deepest fears and superstitions. The vampire we know today is an elegant creation of fiction that bears little.
I just want it. Can you see myself? Can you see myself? Can you see myself?
Nosferatu, Revenant, Aswang, Strigoi, Ubur, Rakshasa, Vampire. Myths and legends from cultures the world over echo the name of creatures risen from the dead to prey on the living. But rarely have they been more real or frightening than in Eastern Europe 300 years ago. In Europe of the 17th century, the secrets of nature were only first being uncovered by science. Superstition was still a way of life. It was in this period, while smoke from the Inquisition and its witch hunts still hung heavily in the air, that the vampire we recognize was first encountered.
Hungary, Moravia, Silesia, and Poland are the principal theater of these happenings. For here we are told that dead men who have been dead for several months, I say, return from the tomb, are heard to speak, walk about, in fact,